So again, welcome to all of you. This is a webinar organized by Iframe, Fat Economy and FLIS. And we are very happy to see so many participants with us today. The reason for this webinar, it became rather, it started out rather small. So Jean-Marie and Mark and Koen, we had an idea to organize something for a limited amount of people. And then all of a sudden we saw that more and more people were interested. And so we are now over 60 participants. That being said, after this webinar, we will share our presentations and we will distribute a list of attendees. If you do not like to be on that list, just send me an email. I will wait a small week, and if I haven't heard from you, you'll be on the attendance lists. With regards to the future, we were thinking that it would be good if this would be continued, for example, as a working group at GeoHub, or maybe we can organize a session at EGU in one of the coming years, because we see that more and more people are working with water column data. More and more people, because we have attendees from countries nearby, like the Netherlands, Great Britain, and France, but we also have people from Canada and the United States joining us. So that's a nice variety of people. And also with a large amount, or with a great variety of backgrounds. We have academic people, which are most of them, but then military, industry, mostly dredging and surveying companies, and also governmental agencies, because, for example, Mark and Koen, who are organizing this as well, are with us. Yeah. So this is a general slide to give you a small introduction on Multibeam, but I guess that nobody needs an introduction, but here's one nonetheless. So with Multibeam, what has been done mostly is bathymetry, getting the depth of the seafloor, but also in the last 20-25 years, a lot of backscatter surveys has been done, because both data are usually gathered simultaneously. And a lot of papers already combine these two data sets. But in the most recent years, and recent is, let's say, 10-20 years, also water column data has been gathered. The drawback is that you have a huge amount of data, because you divide your beam into several bins. So instead of having one reflection, you get several for each beam. So your data set becomes rather large, and that's one of the biggest obstacles, is that processing power needs to be accordingly high. Nonetheless, some pioneer studies were already started in the late 90s, early nullies, and this is one of the earlier papers published by Bremer in 2003 and also in 2006. And they studied an oyster farm in southern France, where they detected the growth or the damage of this oyster farm using water column data. You see these 3D sketches here. So also in their paper, they mentioned that they had a lot of difficulties with the processing power, had to diminish the size of the data and so on. But nonetheless, they had a 3D view of their oyster farm. But the applications are numerous. Here are in the circles several applications in which water column data are being used nowadays, and we'll go over a few of them. For example, in fisheries, if you want to have fish schools, you can study them in 3D. And Inambi had a study in 2016 where they studied the ecological behavior of these fish schools. And then the soil was related to the amount of fish in the school, to the depth at which this fish schools occurred. So you can see some nice polar echograms, which will come back later in several presentations, and also a 3D visualization of these fish schools. Also with kelp, and for the non-biologists like Nora and me, I introduced also a picture of kelp. They also have been studied with water column data. There's a study, a recent one by Schimmel, where they put several of these kelp plants organized on the sea bottom, and then they surveyed that area. So they could see that the amount of kelp present was nicely represented in the water column data, that the artifacts also were related to the amount of kelp, but they also introduced a processing pipeline where they could significantly reduce the side lobe artifacts. Then shipwrecks, and this is probably the application which is being used mostly for water column data, because you have, you can use it as extra detections to the bathymetry. Sometimes a mast of a shipwreck is not represented in the bathymetric data set. By gathering water column data, you can pick the mast and you can re-import it into the bathymetric data set, and you have a better representation of the shipwreck. Something which is really important for the least depth in an area, because you are in a busy survey lane or a busy shipping lane. If it is a couple of meters higher, a shipwreck, that makes a big impact. And there's a study by Wiley in 2015 where they showed that usually there's at least half meter difference between the least depth in the bathymetry and in the water column data. And in some studies, there was a depth difference of over 5 meters, meaning that the mast was totally not detected in the bathymetry. Then also gas seeps have been studied already quite intensively with water column data. This is a recent study also by Hicks at the Hikurangi margin in New Zealand, where they use polar echograms and other representations to map the 3D gas seeps in this area. And they show that they could have a tremendous effect on global warming as well. Then also one of the last applications is suspended particulate matter, SPM. Here you see a nice picture of a river in Argentina, where you see, or two rivers in Argentina where they come together. You can see that one of them is very turbid, the other one is very clear. And this was also picked up by the water column data from the Multibeam. And Simmons also used in situ measurements to calibrate his Multibeam water column data. So these are all applications with water column data. And the last one I want to mention is something which will come back later in the presentation by Mark Krosch and Kunde Grendle, is when a dredging vessel was being followed, that you could map the plume from this vessel in 3D using water column data. And this has been done by, this is being done by a master student under the supervision of Mark and Koen in 2017. Then we come to the software. A lot of the commercial software already allow you to load the water column data and to do a couple of small artifacts removal. Like, for example, you can diminish the side lobe with a lot of softwares, but actually the most known ones only focus on re-entering bathymetric data points, so to say. So they only allow you to pick several points in the water column and then also to put them back in your bathymetric data set, which is then most important for shipwrecks. And this is also how they advertise most of their applications, as you can see in these pictures. And so I've listed one from Iframe Water and Chimera from Quincy, or from QPS. Then also IVA and Teledyne Caris allow you to pick water column data points and put them back in bathymetric data sets, and mostly with shipwrecks. However, in this webinar, we will focus more on Sonarscope, which is a software developed by Iframe, and the developer is with us today, Jean-Marie Augustin, and he will give a presentation after this one. So he'll talk more and more about this software. But it allows you to process the data a lot more than the other softwares allow you. Also, they wrote their own visualization software, which is called Globe, and which you see a screenshot on the left, where you can nicely combine polar echograms from water column data and bathymetric data sets. That only leaves me with going over the agenda for today. So in a few minutes, Jean-Marie will give a lecture or a webinar on Sonarscope and Globe itself, how they developed it, what is possible with it. Then Nore and me will take over again for half an hour talking about the Timbers project, where we combine multibeam data and other turbidity measurements. And then after 11 o'clock, Mark and Koen from FOD Economy will talk about sediment plumes and water column data because they have a lot of experience with it. And then we'll have a rather large break that is for you to allow you to send us some questions or some remarks based on these three presentations. and then you can rejoin at 2 o'clock, and we will discuss all of your remarks and maybe go into depth a bit more. All of these questions can be sent to us or to me using my email address, or you can put them in the chat, and then we'll try to summarize them a bit and discuss them in the afternoon session. So then I'll leave you in the good hands of Jean-Marie, and enjoy the webinar.
Hello. Do you hear me?
Yes, Jean-Marie.
Yes. So I have a problem with my screen sharing. What do you see, Thomas?
It's perfect. We see the presentation view.
With the comments or not?
Without comments.
Ah, perfect. Ah. Okay. So thank you, Thomas and Mark, to have organized this webinar on the use of Multibeam Ecosounder water column data. I prepared this talk with my colleague Carla Scalabrin, who works in the Iframe geology department. She is currently on board the research vessel Pourquoi Pas for a scientific cruise where the water column data is of great interest. Here is an overview of what we will discuss today. I will briefly go over Iframe's scientific research areas, the French oceanographic fleet on which our team depends, and our team's field of expertise, as well as our 2 favorite softwares for seabed cartography. Next, I will describe the data types delivered by the Multibeam Ecosounders, bathymetry, reflectivity, and water column data. I will show you some examples of the main use of water column data at Iframe. We will look at the nature of the received sonar signal in geometry and intensity. I will describe the numerous defects of the Multibeam Ecosounder data, so water columns, the artifacts, the transmission sector variable gains, the change of levels when the sound modes change, and so on. I will describe some water column data reflectivity processing, such as the eco-integration, the automatic removal of some artifacts, and so on. I will present the work we have been doing for years to calibrate the seabed angular backscatter and the expected impact on water column data quality. And we will conclude with a brief demonstration of Sonarscope and Globe. Okay, Iframe stands for Institut Français de Recherche pour l'Exploitation de la Mer. It's a National Institute for Ocean Science. The research activity is carried out in 4 scientific departments: the oceanography and ecosystem dynamics, physical resources and deep sea ecosystems. Carla Scalabrin is a member of this department. Biological resources and environment, marine and digital infrastructures. The French oceanographic fleet comprises a variety of research vessels, deep sea, coastal, and station ships, and operates underwater devices such as AUVs, deep sea submarine, and so on. The deep sea vessels are all equipped of deep and shallow Multibeam Ecosounder systems, Kongsberg EM 122, 72, 304, 2040, and Reson 7150 and 7111. Lot of other vessels and the AUVs are equipped of Kongsberg 2040. Our team, ASTI, belongs to the Direction de la Flotte Océanographique. It is composed of acousticians and software development engineers. The range of our activities is quite large. It goes from engineering in acoustic sensors, fisheries and cartographic sounders, acoustic measurements in pool and at sea, calibration of sensors. A growing area of interest is also the environmental acoustic for marine mammal protection. The software development activity is also an important part of our team's work. Globe offers a complete chain of bathymetric data processing modules. Cyril Poncelet is a software manager for this software and Sonarscope too. Globe is a very efficient 4D viewer of georeferenced data. It is based on NASA Whirlwind library. Sonarscope is a multifunction tool similar to a Swiss Army knife. It is firstly a research and development tool. Its efficiency in this domain relies on its multi-layer structuration of the data. If I had to summarize Sonarscope in 3 points, I would say quality control of the sonar and multibeam Ecosounder raw data. Second, data processing, especially the reflectivity and the water column data. And finally, help to interpret the results. Here is an example of a Sonarscope menu. It launches an inspection of 3D matrix of water column data. The results of the action are displayed on the right. If there are 3 cross sections of the matrix according to the 3 axes of the parallelepiped. Now let's go back to the data delivered by a multibeam Ecosounder. Since you all know this kind of data, I will quickly skip to the next slide. I would just like to highlight how the reflectivity is complementary to the bathymetry. In the west part of the reflectivity, you can see, you can distinguish 2 acoustic facies, here and here, and whereas the bathymetry is quite homogeneous here. Before going into details on the raw column data and how we process it, I would like to show you the main way Iframe uses this data. We started to use the water column data in 2009 with an EM302 on the research vessel Le Surroi in the Marmara Sea. The purpose here was to the detection and localization of gas emission. During such surveys, the water column data is an essential tool for, to plan the CTD and AUV dives and so on. The image on the left shows 2 polar echograms where several gas emissions appear. The second image comes from the resonance 7150 at 24 kilohertz in deep sea water of Nigeria. A double gas emission appears on the 3 consecutive navigation lines. The gas emission is seen at nadir for 2 lines and at the end of the swath for the second one. Let's try again. First, second, 3, third. This second slide illustrates the search of hydrothermal sites for the mineral resources team at Iframe. The image on the left is a polar echogram of a deep water EM122 multibeam Ecosounder, where the seafloor is 1,600 meters deep. Carla Scalabrin could identify a very weak signal here. The decision was taken by the scientific team to plan a dive with the AUV. The image on the right here is the echogram of the EM 2040 on the AUV, where an active hydrothermal chimney was discovered. A dive of the Nautil, the Nautil submarine, confirmed visually this discovery. This thermal chimney was named Obelix. Let us look at the nature of the multi-beam Ecosounder column data. To understand how it works, let's look at one of the reception beams. Let us take beam number 100, for example, for this sounder. For this sounder, the total number of beams is 280. Some sounders deliver almost 1,000 beams. The beam number 100 is tilted sideways of about 20 degrees on port. The angle of the external beams can reach 75 degrees. The top right image is the water column data displayed as an image. Yeah. The ordinates are in ordinate, we have the sample numbers from the sonar head to the end of the sampling record, a little more than 400 here. The abscissa are the beam numbers, and our beam 100 intercepts gas plumes here. The water column data acquisition geometry is named sample beams in the Sonarscopian language. This geometry is not readable for human because every column is coming from a different angle. So we apply a geometric transformation to display the data in a Cartesian geometry. We call it depth across distance geometry in the Sonarscopian vocabulary. The signal received on beam 100 is plotted here. The seafloor is detected here around number 250, and the gas plume is visible here from 125 to 225. Some water column data processings have to be done in the sample beam geometry, and others must be done on this one. Yes, now with this slide, I will try to explain why the water column data image is very noisy under a cycle which is tangent to the seafloor. Hard work. The sounder emits a short acoustic waves, which is a constraint in the transversal plane of the ship. This acoustic pulse is scattered in many directions when it collides with obstacles. You see, the sound is arriving here, and you have echoes going there, and an echo going back to the sounder. So, as I said, you will principally return towards sorry. In case of flat seafloor, the echo will principally return towards the sounder, mainly vertically. If the seafloor is flat, this is what we call the specular. For any object that facies perpendicular to the sounder direction, the echo will be principally backscattered in the same direction, opposite way. This can happen for wrecks or sharp seafloors. When we are not in a specular situation, a small quantity of energy is backscattered to the sounder. This is due to the roughness of the seafloor or shells or small objects laid on the seafloor. These objects have many facets oriented perpendicularly to the sounder. On this slide, I symbolize the quantity of backscattered energy in 3 directions. The letter S corresponds to the specular of the nadir. Its energy is I. Point O corresponds to the backscattered signal for a slightly tilted angle, and point G for an important grazing angle. The energy backscattered by these points decrease when the beam tilt angle is high. Look at these curves. Energy of point S, O, G, and so on. For a given seafloor type, we have an angular backscatter curve here named backscatter of theta. Now let's look at how the sounder works. The multi-beam Ecosounder listens to the sonar echoes in a great number of narrow reception beams, typically 1 degree beam. You see here an example. So it's 1 degree here. The directivity beam diagram is made of a main lobe here, which generally amplifies the echo coming back from this direction, but also side lobes here, which amplify signals from all directions, but with a weaker gain. For a tilted beam, the main lobe greatly amplifies the backscatter echo, which is weak, but its side lobes will amplify with a quite weaker gain the specular, which is very high. This explains why the water column data is noisy here. The cycle corresponds to the arrival time of the first echo coming back from the seafloor. Let's look at this example now. The sounder surveys a wreck. One can see very clearly the specular of the wreck here. On the first image, we are going to display two cross sections, one at the nadir and one far from the wreck. In this last image, we can clearly see here at the nadir, and here we can clearly see the wreck, even though the cross section is far from it. We could say that the specular phenomenon is a ghost maker. One could wonder if the ghosts are specific to wrecks or sharp relief. Let us look at this data now where a gas emission appears at the nadir. Look at these parts of this image. They are indeed copies of the gas plumes imaged by the side lobes of the tilt beams. Here we have the echo integration of the water column data wrapped on the seafloor. We can see the footprints of the ghost. We will come back to this in few slides. Here are the footprints of the ghosts. I introduced the side effects of the beam diagram side lobes in the transverse direction, but the same phenomenon does exist in the longitudinal direction. You see here the copies of the principal one. So, and you have the footprints of the longitudinal ghosts here in these directions. So take care. The interpretation of water column data requires good expertise. Let us detail now how the eco-integration is processed. We saw that the usable part of data is over the specular cycle, but the gas plumes or hydrothermal sites require to observe the data as near as possible of the seafloor. We therefore defined a ring here, where we extract the data that is seen here, and we sum, this data is summed vertically, should say averaged. The eco-integration signal for this ping is plotted here. You see the plume here. And ping after ping, the eco-integration signal constitutes an image in the Sonarscopian geometry named ping across distance. And this image is then projected into a cartographic layer. This allows to map the water column data events, as you saw in the last two slides. Here. Sonarscope offers an eco-integration method above the seafloor, but we won't discuss it here. The Kongsberg sounders use several transmission angular sectors to insonify the seafloor. These transmission beam diagrams that we will call sectors do not deliver homogeneous data. They can be significant, there can be significant offsets of mean value for one sector to its neighbor, or between the same sector for the two consecutive swaths in the double swath mode. Then these characteristics still vary when the sounder changes its configuration as shallow, medium, or deep modes. You will understand here that the sounders are not calibrated. Therefore, the delivered data is not absolute. It is a relative value. These homogeneities produce undesirable artifacts in the eco-integration images. Sonarscope proposes a method to correct the data to get rid of these inconveniences. This compensation consists in subtracting for every time sample the median value computed on the beams. This is done separately in every sector, and this works well if the noise is the majority of the data. If that is not the case, it won't work. The raw images are displayed on the left, yeah, and the compensated ones on the right. So you don't see anymore these change of levels. On the previous image, there was nothing to see in the water column data. On this one, a gas plume is visible at the end of the swath, here and at the end. Here is the compensated image, and you can see that the contrast can be pushed stronger on the compensated image. That helps to scrutinize the data. And the two images are complementary. The raw data is the reference. This slide demonstrates the benefit of the compensation technique. The lateral ghost footprints disappear with these lines on the eco-integration of the compensated ecograms. The water column data can be spoiled by acoustic signals produced by other systems such as navigation sounders. Yeah. We have here an example where such a sounder was used. The pulse rate is 4 to 5 times higher than the multibeam ecosounder. This data can be used for science only if we remove the spoiled parts of the images. This processing would be quite simple to implement in the geometry sample beam, because in this geometry, the circles are horizontal lines. Let us see the result of the eco-integration on a wall survey. The left image is a navigation plot with the mode type in color, green for medium, red for deep. And the mosaic of eco-integration here reflects the sounder mode. What a pity. You understand that it is essential for science to use calibrated sounders that deliver identical data regardless of the configuration of the systems and reproducible from one ship to the other. Okay, as the calibration of multibeam ecosounder is not performed by the manufacturers, we undertook a cross-calibration using fisheries single-beam ecosounders such as Simrad EK80. These sounders are omnidirectional. They have very low side lobes, and they can locate very accurately the echoes in their reception lobes thanks to the amplitude and phase measurements in both directions. These sounders are calibrated using a tungsten ball, which is placed under the hull thanks to the motorized pods. The EK80 precisely locates the ball and measures the return value. As we perfectly know the expected backscatter value from the ball, we just have to adjust the gain level of the sounder to get a calibrated sensor. We then screw the EK80 sounder on a pan and tilt system, and we do measurements for a lot of tilted angles on a reference area. We obtain a reference angular backscatter curve, which is specific to the area. Here there are several. We then survey the area with the multibeam ecosounder, and using clever algorithms, in Sonarscope of course, we can compute compensation curves of every sector for all the configurations usable on the area. We can then use these curves in post-processing or update them into the sounder in order it delivers directly calibrated data. You may wonder why I am speaking of calibration of the seabed reflectivity, even though our topic here is water column data. The seabed image is extracted from the water column data. So the calibration of the former will also work on the later. We will confirm or not these hypotheses next weekend on board research vessel Thalassa. I will finish my talk with this slide, which is a nod to the injunctions we continually hear. Why don't you do machine learning or deep learning? This slide illustrates the result obtained by one of the simplest signal processing algorithms, the mean square value. Its use here allows us to detect gas plumes beyond human perception, as here, you see this one could be imaged up to the top and locate them more precisely. compared to this, you see? So why should we use heavy artillery whereas a simple Swiss Army knife can do it? So thank you. And sorry, now I can switch to short demonstrations. At first, I'm going to show you a small program that is used to check the data in a 3D matrix. So here you have the one ecogram.
Jean-Marie, you are not sharing your screen.
Sorry?
You're not sharing the screen. We are only seeing you right now.
Okay, and is it okay now?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, so here you have 4 windows. Here the water column data in the depth across distance. Here the column data in depth pings, and here the water column data in across distance pings. When I move the mouse on one image, you display the data in the 2 other images, and same here. So we can here we can see some gas plumes, and we can move on it. We can, if I click here, okay, we are, and I can also move on this part. Okay. Now we are going to switch onto globe. So I suppose I have to redo the sharing.
Yeah, indeed.
Ah, where is it? I'm sorry.
I stopped your sharing. Now you can share your new screen.
Okay. Is it okay?
Now we see globe.
Okay. So at first we are going to see up. Sorry. Go to. Okay, you are arriving in Belgium, where at first I'm going on these data, and I can show you that we that is okay. For example, I move the azimuth of the sun shading, and you see that you have an immediate display of the image. I'm going to this one. Okay, here you have a series of bathymetry maps that were made during years, and I'm going to move them, and at the same time I can sorry, half of the image disappeared. And you can see the evolution of the dunes in time. Now let's go, I still have time, yes. Stop me if I'm too long.
You still have 10 minutes.
Okay. Now we are going to the Marmara Sea. Okay. Okay, here you have the Marmara Seas, Bosphore, Black Sea, and you have an area here where I will not speak of geology. I'm not a scientist in this field, so I wouldn't risk to say stupid things. Okay, and I can display the water column data, and so we see the gas plumes here, and with the 3D matrix I can display these data, and we can move it in the vertical according to the across distances. Now I'm going to another part of this data of this area. Oh, sorry, no, not this one. Okay. Okay, here we have another part of the Marmara Sea where you have a gas plume. So you see that on the bathymetry there is an event. So I could move the water column data. But what I would like to show you is here we have a 3D block, seismic CD block, and I can move the seismic, and I'm going to find the intersection of it with the water column data. And I can go underneath. And you see here that where we have the gas plumes, the sediments are, we lost the continuity of the sediment. So this tool allows to see data on the terrain, have the reflectivity, eco-integration, bathymetry. The bathymetry, the elevation is a real elevation of your data, of course. And you can also display data as sub-bottom profiler data, seismic, and a lot of others. Okay, that's all I plan to show. So, Nore, if you are ready to begin, I let you the screen.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Marie, for your presentation. And with your questions, you can always send them again in the chat or an email, and then we will discuss them this afternoon. Okay, and indeed, now Nore and me, we will give a presentation on the Timbers project. And for that, I will share my screen.
I don't find where to.
It's okay, I already
did it.
disconnected
Okay.
your screen, Jean-Marie.
Thank you.
Right. So indeed, after Jean-Marie's talk about Sonarscope and Globe itself, Nore and me, we will be talking about a project which we, or especially Nore, has been working on the last 2 years, 1.5, 2 years. And this is called the Timbers project. Within the Timbers project, or the acronym of Timbers stands for 3D turbidity assessment through integration of multibeam echo sounding and optical remote sensing. That's a mouthful, but what it comes down to is that we are going to combine satellite data, which is optical data, and that is being handled by Vito, our project partner in this, or project partner, of course, and then the multibeam echo sounding, which will deliver the subsurface, and that's being handled by this. And combined, we will try to get a 3D grid of turbidity in the Belgian part of the North Sea, which is a Marine Strategic Framework Directive. So that's always a good thing. When we're talking about 3D, we have to give you a cautious note. It's only a semi-3D image because, of course, with the water column data, you're missing a part of the upper layers due to the opening angle of the multibeam. For those of you not familiar with turbidity, what is it? In one slide, basically it's a cloudiness of water. In the introduction, I've showed you this nice image about of the coming together of two rivers in Argentina with low and high turbidity. Well, this nicely illustrates what turbidity is. It's basically the degree to which water loses its transparency. And that's due to the sediment which is present within the water column. Turbidity is usually expressed in NTU, but there are a wide range of variables in which it can be expressed. Why do we care about turbidity? Well, first of all, you cannot see anything in the water, which is important for divers and ROVs, for example, but also because it has a negative effect on the water quality and basically on aquatic life then, because it can contain contaminants. And like I told you before, it's a mandatory parameter which needs to be measured in the Marine Strategic Framework Directive, and they recommend a 3D approach in this turbidity assessment. In this image, you can see an image of the turbidity within the Belgian part of the North Sea. And then you can see that close to the Scheldt River and close to the coast, there is a high turbidity, and then it diminishes gradually going offshore. Now we needed to pick a survey area for our project, and we decided to go with the Quinte acoustic reference area. Why? Because you can see that it's on the link between low and high turbidity, that it's at the intersection. So we expect some natural variation within that area. And also because it is next to the reference area, the acoustic reference area. So there are no bottom disturbing activities allowed there anymore. So that means the signal that we pick up will only be natural variation. Also, we just shifted our survey area a bit towards the southwest because now we include a live watch station. And live watch is an S3 program where we measure several parameters monthly. And at that station, we have monthly SPM measurements. So that's always good for calibration purposes within the Timbers project. Which tools do we use? Of course, we make use of a multibeam system, which is the hull-mounted EM2040 dual system on board of the Simon Steven, which is the research vessel of VLIS. And then we use a variety of turbidity sensors. We, of course, take water samples with the Niskin bottles. Then we also use the VPR, which is that nice equipment that you see, but we also attach a OBS and a list to the VPR. And then the VPR makes movements through the water column, and we get various measurements of turbidity with a range of sensors. If you look at the sensors in another way, you can say that we have 3 optical sensors, which is the list, OBS, and the VPR, because the VPR takes images of the water column. We have, of course, in situ water samples, which are then sent to the lab for analysis. And of course, we have an acoustic sensor, which is our multibeam. How do we measure turbidity in timbers? I think the Niskin bottles speak for themselves. We just analyze the amount of suspended material within the bottles or within the bucket sample we take at the surface. The VPR, as I've told you before, takes images of the water column. These images are usually analyzed for plankton analysis because VPR is short for video plankton recorder, but we can also use it for turbidity assessment. And then Multibeam and the OBS make use of backscattering of either light or sound on particles in the water column, and the list works with laser diffraction. And the list gives you grain sizes of the particles in the water column, but also a total volume concentration. Because we are towing the VPR through the water column, we cannot use the GPS of the vessel anymore. And that's why since a couple of months, we started using our GAP system to locate the VPR and to precisely match water column data with in situ turbidity measurements. And here on this 3D image, you can see a yo-yo movement of our VPR through the water column in our reference area. Also for this project, we have developed a workflow which starts with setting the right parameters in the Multibeam, and then also seeing that its deployment is being done, but also setting a sampling strategy for the turbidity sensors. After that, we will process both data sets and correlate them to get a correlation between turbidity and acoustic decibel values from the Multibeam. We will first focus on the Multibeam part. I know that normally for these types of research, you would need to calibrate your system, as Jean-Marie explained with the EK 80. But because our project only goes for 2.5 years, we decided not to go for the calibration, but to always use the same system at fixed settings. And in the beginning of the project, we defined the optimal settings for our project. And so in the SIS, which is Seafloor Information System, the software from Kongsberg, we always use the highest frequency, which is 400 kilohertz for our Multibeam system. We use long pulse lengths, and these two combined give you the highest possible signal to noise ratio, but we also switch off all filters. Normally in a bathymetric survey, you would switch on a number of filters to get out the water column detections, but in this case, we don't do that and we switch off all the filters. Also, we make sure that we survey in single sector, because we saw that surveying with multiple sectors gives you several artifacts. And to give you an example of that, these are 2 papers which have been published already. And you can see that, especially in the paper from Peter Urban, that multiple sectors give you some artifacts which are then harder to process afterwards. So that's why we decided to go for single sector to not get these artifacts at least. Also, we played a bit with the transducer power, the yaw stabilization, and also with the beam overlap. When we had no beam overlap between the two heads, we saw that we also didn't have an artifact. And you can clearly see on the left image that due to the overlap between the 2 heads, we have a small artifact. So that's why we decided to go for no overlap between the 2 heads. And that also gives you no gap. That's what we feared for, but there's no gap in the data. Also, because we want the highest possible signal to noise ratio, it makes no sense whatsoever to reduce the power of the transmission. So that's why these 2 are already out. And then with yaw stabilization, we saw no real effect on our water column data. And then we went into contact with Kongsberg, and they told us that yaw stabilization is especially relevant when you're working with multiple sectors. As I've told you before, that introduces an artifact. We decided that it was not necessary for yaw stabilization. So that gave us our setting 2, which we call it, which we are going to use throughout the project. Also for the turbidity sensors, we need a strict sampling strategy. And you already saw with the gaps that we conduct a yo-yo movement of this VPR, but this then nicely illustrates it again. So while the ship is going as slowly as possible through the survey area, which is usually below 3 knots, depending on the currents, of course, we let the VPR go up and down all the time. The VPR, but also the attached list and OBS. So we get a range of turbidity measurements while acquiring Multibeam data. Also, we asked the captain to switch off all possible Ecosounders, and we asked them especially not to use a bow propeller. Why? Because these 2 introduce artifacts, which of course, if you have them in your data, they are harder to get rid of. If you can avoid them, that's always, of course, always a better way of working. And you see that dynamic positioning, which basically uses your bow propellers, gives you some artifacts in the water column data, but also you get a static artifact when, for example, a single beam Ecosounder is used when the multi-beam is switched on. We also tested during one of the first survey what would be the best way of surveying. We always assume that if you drift, you don't use any engine, that would be the best option to, or to get the least amount of artifacts. But as it turned out, as you can see on the right-hand side, that sailing at a slow speed actually yielded the best results, so the least artifacts. And with drifting, we saw small artifacts in the upper part of the water column. Of course, turning on bow propellers gives you a huge amount of interference and artifacts, and then sailing on the right-hand side was the best option. Then we come to the processing part of the data, and that's where I leave you in the good hands of Nora, who will discuss everything related to processing.
Yes, so in the Timbers project, the processing of large quantities of water column multibeam data is done in Sonarscope. And since this study of water column multibeam data was a rather new field, there was no existing or tailored procedure to convert our raw multibeam data in Sonarscope into the XYZ format that we wanted. So the past year and a half, we are in contact with Jean-Marie, and we created this processing pipeline to visualize and export water column data from Sonarscope. So now we will have a look at each step. So first we create polar echograms, and then there is the water column data cleaning. And this step requires a little bit more background information on artifacts. So what you consider as an artifact largely depends on your project. So in the Timbers project, we are interested in turbidity, so SPM. So basically for us, all the other features on the polar echograms are artifacts. So in the past year and a half, we encountered three big groups of artifacts. First of all, the multi-beam specific artifacts. So you have the very clear side lobes. But in the Timbers project, that is no issue because we only export water column data from within a minimum slant range. So excluding these side lobes. You lose information, but at the same time, you also win time because you don't have to deal with them. And then, like Thomas already mentioned, you have the multi-sector artifacts, but that is no problem because we have a single sector setting. And then there can also be some unclean bathymetry spikes, but these can be avoided by a more rigorous real-time data cleaning. And then finally, the biofouling we also encountered, sadly, because it can seriously deteriorate the data quality and you can have issues with your outer beams like you see here. So this can be avoided by a more regular check of the transducers. Then, like Thomas said, there can be acoustic interferences from the ship, like the dynamic positioning or other Ecosounder that can cause unwanted signals, but we make sure that during the survey they are switched off. And then lastly, the group of incidental targets. So these are real features such as fish or a bubble wake, but we are just not focusing on them in the Timbers project. So it's important that we can discriminate them from an SPM plume, and sometimes that's very straightforward because of the geometry of the feature or the positioning, as for example, the bubble wake that you see there. But sometimes it's also not clear if what we are seeing is a fish school or an SPM plume. And when it's an SPM plume, what is it then? Is it sediments? Is it plankton? Is it bubbles? Luckily, we have a bunch of in situ sensors in our Timbers toolbox that can definitely help and discriminate to some extent. But we still think that this issue should be further explored in the future because at the moment there is a lot of uncertainty of what targets and what target sizes and shapes the multi-beam captures and with which settings. So in the Timbers project, we try to avoid most of these artifacts in red by an adequate setting and a good sampling strategy, and the remainder of the artifacts can then be deleted afterwards in Sonarscope. So there are two approaches. The option 1 is you manually scroll through each polar echogram and you delete those polar echograms with a lot of artifacts in them. Or the second option is you use the echo integration function from Sonarscope. So what is echo integration? Echo integration is used to calculate a signal for a certain part of the water column. So first you have to define a calculation area. So in this example for Mark, the calculation area was defined by a slant range between 60 and 90%, and then a beam angle between -30 and 30. And then you must choose in Sonarscope the correct signal. And for spotting artifacts, it's best to use quantile 2. These are the upper percentiles. And then finally, you get a screen showing the signal that you chose over time. And this is when the real data cleaning starts. Now you can start selecting the peaks and delete them. Now, data cleaning can be very straightforward this way. For example, when you have an Ecosounder artifact with a very typical pattern, it's very clear to spot the spikes and delete them. However, sometimes a very clear artifact on the polar echogram doesn't show up on the screen. So that's a problem. And a second problem is that when you have a very small artifact on the polar echogram in Sonarscope, when you delete the artifact, you immediately delete the complete polar echogram for further processing. So considering the large data sets that we have in the Timbers project and the bulk statistics that we need to do, we decided to skip this data cleaning step in Sonarscope for now, but we hope that in the future there will be a way to automatically detect these artifacts and to delete them, and a possibility to only delete the artifact area instead of the complete polar echogram. So this is a call to you, the Multibeam community. If you have ideas to move this topic forward, please let's discuss this afternoon. Then in the next step of the processing chain, the polar echograms are stacked into a semi-3D water volume. And then there are two ways to process the data further. You have a 2D approach and a 3D approach. In the 2D approach, we first build a 3D matrix, and then we use the in situ sensor track, so the VPR track, to make a vertical cutaway here in orange within the 3D water volume. And as a result, you generate a 2D slice with georeference decibel values that you can easily compare with the in situ measurements. Then in the 3D approach, the multibeam data is exported as massive point clouds, and these point clouds are then loaded into Entwine, which is a data organization library originally intended for LiDAR data. So afterwards, the data can be visualized in PO3 Viewer. So this is an example for the same underwater plume structure visualized in 2D in globe, and then in detail in 3D. And you can see the difference in resolution is striking. So this 3D approach holds a lot of potential. The green banding that you see, that is just a visualization artifact. So now finally, we have two data sets with georeference decibel values and turbidity values. But before we can statistically correlate the data, both data sets need to be spatially merged. And as the multibeam data can be exported in a 2D slice or in a 3D point cloud, there are also two merging approaches. So in the 2D merging approach, all multibeam points within a predefined radius around each sensor measurement are averaged. So for example, so using the 2D approach with a radius of 0.5 meter, this is the statistical correlation between the log total volume concentration from the list and the decibel values from the multibeam. So we have an R² of 0.466. In the 3D merging approach, a sphere filled with hundreds or thousands of multibeam points is cut out around each sensor measurement and averaged. Then we also investigated which parameter, so which in situ parameter, the log TVC or the log beam attenuation from the list, or the turbidity from the OBS, and which radius gave the best R² value. And apparently the log TVC and a radius of 2.5 meters gave the best R² for this example. So using these parameters, this is the statistical correlation between the log TVC and the decibel values. So the R² value has improved. But I want to stress that this is just one example and we need to test it out on a lot more survey lines, of course. So to conclude, in the past year and a half, we have developed a workflow to acquire, process, and correlate water column multibeam data with in situ sensor data. Now, the next milestone for us is to use these linear regression models and to convert the acoustic decibels from all survey lines into a 3D turbidity block. Now, the closing remark that I want to make is that the processing of water column multibeam data not only requires a lot of PC power, but also a lot of patience, because it takes a really long time to process these huge files. Check out, for example, the gigabytes of data that we have already collected and processed in Sonarscope. So if it would be good for us in the future if this processing can be reduced in time, maybe by the use of supercomputers, or maybe if there can be a way to reduce the file sizes. So if you have brilliant ideas, please definitely come this afternoon. So in the following months, Thomas and I are really looking forward to the Timbers campaigns, always on dates with satellite overpass. And for each campaign, we will apply the workflow that we have developed this year. And we try to create a 3D turbidity block that then can be combined with the satellite-derived turbidity in the surface layer. So I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank my wonderful colleagues for organizing this webinar. And I especially want to thank Tim Collard, who has helped us a lot with the processing. So thank you. And then finally, something fun. So we set up, especially for this webinar, an interactive tool. So we exported a point cloud. And so in the break, you can definitely check this out and try out what you think of our 3D point clouds. So Thomas is showing it now. So we will put the link in the chat box, so you can definitely try out yourself. Okay, I think we now have a small break, and then we see you guys later.
Yeah, I think we are a bit ahead of schedule. Yeah, so I assume we can reconvene at 11 for the next presentation. And like Nora said, we will put the link to this nice viewer in the chat, and you can all have a look at one of the survey lines from Tinder. So see you guys back at 11.
Thomas, can you hear me?
Yes, Marc?
Yes, oui. Tu devrais brancher ça. We will split our presentation in two parts because it's difficult to present that from the same PC for us.
Okay.
Okay. Can we try with Koen and after that with me briefly?
Yeah, but this is still with all participants, so it's going to be.
Oh, it's not a problem. Huh? We are a big family at the end.
That's true.
Okay. We will first copy the link in the chat and then we can have a test.
Yes, please.
Kan ik even kopiëren? Zo, ik zie hem in de chat.
Nog. Ja.
What?
Ah, okay.
Yeah, Mark, go ahead with your test.
Mais le bouton vert. Et tu choisis présentation mode.
Yeah, it started sharing, and now I see the presenter part of your presentation. Yeah.
So we let it like that, okay?
Yeah, just a small thing. There's a small black rectangle in the upper right. I guess that's from Zoom where you have who's talking. If you could drag that away or put it somewhere in the lower left or something, because now it's like in the middle of the screen. Ah, yeah, now it's gone. Yeah. Okay, so we just leave it like this for in 10 minutes. Okay, so see you guys then. Mark and Koen, whenever you are ready, you can start with your presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Yeah, excellent. Hi, everybody. This talk will focus on one application of all of you've heard about, mainly detection of sediment plumes. And we've split this presentation in two parts. So in the first part, I will be talking a little bit over our I'll give you an overview of our experience with water column and Sonarscope. And the second part will talk about, let's say, what we consider important to share with you. So, continue. So, first, why are we interested in these sediment plumes? So on the Belgian continental shelf, there's a lot of users, and they all produce sediment plumes. We have a lot of wind turbines, we have lots of fisheries, and we have dredging. And all these are confined on a reasonably small area. And all these sediment plumes play a role, have an impact on their environment, and so are important to assess a good environmental status. And we need a good knowledge of them to comply with Europe's Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So it's important to know as much as possible about them. So Mark, Florian, and me, we all work for the Continental Shelf Department of the Federal Public Service Economy, and our main task is to control and manage and so the impact of sand extraction. So that's why we focus mostly on the impact from trailing suction hopper dredgers on the Belgian continental shelf. So these types of ship produce sediment plumes, and you can see on the image on the left now, this one part is caused by overflow sediment from the ship. The second part is produced at the dredge head itself on the sea bottom. And the third part is due to screening, where some larger material is redumped on the sea. So all these sediment plumes have produced a direct and indirect impact on the environment, the sediments, the habitats, and they cause turbidity. And let's say the main project that we have is to evaluate if Multibeam is an interesting tool to study these sediment plumes. So these images, the very recent images from last month, you see a dredging vessel and the sediment plume it produces, and you can clearly see the clear delimitation of it and the size of it, the importance, and you can see inside the plume there's a lot of heterogeneity. There is a lot of let's say swirling character of the sediment plume. So I'm going to give you a short chronological overview of our let's say our experience with Sonarscope and Globe. So we started in 2016, and we did a survey with the research vessel Simmons Divin and the EM2040 aboard, single RX. So this was our first, let's say, experience with detecting sediment plumes. So our main goal was to evaluate if we could detect them. So we followed a couple of ships on the Belgian continental shelf, and we got some nice results. So we see some things happening in the water column. So at the first, let's say, result is, okay, we can detect these water column, the sediment plumes in the water column. But like you see in the small window on the bottom right, we have some artifacts, some questions that arise, interference, noise, and so on. But we will talk about that later. We, like Jean-Marie explained, we all process this data in Sonarscope. So we had to look at the water column, the echograms. We, yep, okay. So we can limit it to the part that's, let's say, the useful part of it, for interesting. So we skip the specular. We can project that on the seafloor, the echo integration, as we call it, and so we can get a good idea of the area that's impacted, the area where we see the sediment plumes. Because it gives us an idea of where we find the plumes, gives an idea of, let's say, the importance of the plume, but there's not yet any, let's say, real information on how the internal build up of this plume, the structure of it. So in 2018, we did a new test survey with a lot of partners. So we did use the same upgraded system. So it's a dual RX now. On the Simon Steven, we worked with our colleagues from Geomar and OD Nature and ILVO to have, let's say, to gather as much as we can quantitative information on sediment plumes of different nature and combine this with in situ measurements of the water column. So in this talk, we'll only focus on, let's say, the multi-beam part of this experiment. So you were tracking different plumes of different origin. You can see on the movie a couple of the ships that were involved. So we had a couple of trawling vessels. We had some vessels busy with sand extraction, dredging vessel, and we also combined it with a measurement through 13 hours tidal cycle to get an idea of the natural turbidity in the water, and if we could measure that also with this water column. So this is a first movie. This is when we are following a drilling suction hopper dredger again. So you get this is a 3D visualization in globe. So the data processed in Sonarscope. You see the polar echogram following track of the ship. You have the on the seafloor the vertical projection, and you got the long track slices along the sediment plumes. And we can, okay, make that ferry across the plume. So, and here we already start to see or get some information about the, let's say, the structure of the sediment plume. This is the same survey. So when we're following a trawling vessel, and you can directly see that the sediment plumes are a little bit different. They're more located close to the sea bottom. And if you look at the polar echograms, you see a lot of turbidity at the top of the area. That is of the top of the polar echogram. And this is noise due to the ship. But we can again look at them vertically, horizontally, and get an idea of the importance of this sediment plume and when we and where we cross it and not. So so we we also wanted some quantitative information on the sediment plumes. So we did some statistical analysis with Sonarscope on, let's say, the important part of the polar echogram of the water column. So we can define an area and calculate statistics inside it. This gives us the opportunity to, let's say, to create time series and get a concise description of those sediment plumes. So you can see there's a one on the left is like a seawater, and that's the background noise when you have, and there's no sediment plume in the water column. And then we see sediment plume from a dredging vessel with very high values peaking, and a sediment plume from a fishing vessel, where we also see sediment plumes, but less important than with a dredging vessel. And this gives us the opportunity also to correlate this with the measurements we get on turbidity, on SPM, and so on, from the in-situ measurements we did during the same campaign. Now, in 2020, we did, let's say, a third experiment. So, and this time we focalized on the optimization of the survey conditions. So we said, okay, we focalize on single sector, and we want to avoid all noise and interference. We want to eliminate all the artifacts ahead and see, because it creates a lot of work to eliminate them and makes good quantitative analysis more difficult. So I think Noor and Thomas talked about it already this morning, just a little bit earlier. So we try to avoid all artifacts. So this is a nice overview of all of the measurements we did. This is a nice overview from our colleague Florian made. So on the left you have the two vessels. You can see them geographically plotted. You have the red, you have the survey vessel, and in green is the vessel that produces sediment plume. This is a dredging vessel, and you can see that we cross the ship track more or less. And the black arrows indicate the average current orientation. So that explains why we cross, for instance, now at the moment we're crossing on the top left right side. We cross the sediment plume, let's say to the north east of the vessel producing it. So you can clearly see the importance of the sediment plume, and on the graph beneath it, you can follow the impact on the backscatter, on the values inside the geometry, the central geometry. We can also look at it in globe. This is the same survey. You can see in red again, survey vessel. In black is the track of the dredging vessel, and you can see it's the same representation. The sediment plumes we cross in different areas, and I think we'll focus on the last track where we cross the ship track of the dredging vessel twice. First, we get the let's say the same sediment plume as the first two times, but we'll see it in a couple of seconds. The second plume is more important. I think we were more closer to the ship when we crossed this one. And you can even see that we, at certain error, and the turbidity is that high that we lose the bottom detection for an important part of the measurements. And difference with earlier, the previous pictures we've shown you from the former campaign, you see there is almost no artifact in the water column data. So this is more as an overview of our experience. I will now give the change the talk to my colleague Mark, and just joke.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, both are okay, Mark.
Okay, so in this first part, we discuss some critical points to keep in mind during data acquisition. Noise generated by the vessel and external noise can contaminate the water column data recorded by Multibeam Ecosounder to the point of rendering this data unusable. So we have to keep that under control. On this part of a line recorded with the Simon Stevin following tracking a dredging vessel, of course, all the sensors have been switched off except the multibeam itself. And you see high amplitudes appearing in the upper part of the water column, producing a similar pattern to a plume of sediment just below the sea surface. The appearance of this strong amplitude coincides with the deceleration of the vessel. I don't know if you can see that on the movie, but this deceleration is perceptible with the lower scrolling frequency of the polar echogram. You will see that here. You see the polar echogram slowing up to from that point to the end of the line, so slowly. And let's have a look on what are the data from the eco integration at this level. So we eco-integrate the data in two sectors, on the upper part of the water column and on the lower part of the water column. So you see three curves on the graph. The speed of the vessel is in dark pink, is given in meters per second. You have to multiply by 2 to have that in knots. So the variation of the average amplitude in the upper part of the water column correspond to the green curve, and the blue curve provide you the same variation but measure in the lower sector, close to the bottom. And you see clearly that after decelerating the vessel to a speed of the order of 3 knots, of course, the pilots at that moment made intensive use of the bow propellers to maintain the course of the vessel. And the bow propellers generate a very significant noise in the upper part of the water column. At shallow depths, this noise can contaminate the entire water column and render the data unusable. So rigorous control of the use of bow propellers is absolutely necessary to ensure a good quality of the water column data. Critical points during data acquisition about the settings, but it's for Kongsberg Maritime system. Of course, Noré and Thomas talk a lot about that, but for the Kongsberg system, the user can define himself 2 parameters of the water column that affect the time varied gain function of the water column data. And with the default offset value of 20 dB, that is here, this is the default value, 20 dB. The dynamic range goes from minus 84 decibel to 44 decibel. But echoes in the water column can be weaker than minus 84 decibel. And in order to capture weak echoes and preserve the scattering dynamic as much as possible, our colleagues from Iframe recommend setting this offset to 40 dB. So you have to switch this value to 40 dB to really catch the entire scattering signal in the water column. We verified the influence of this offset on the echo value in the water column 2 months before, and we confirm that that is absolutely true. Here you see clearly that the mean value of the water column change, and you see that this part of the histogram is catch if you log at 40 dB is not catch with the 20 dB offset value. So pay attention to that for people who are using Kongsberg system. What developments are necessary that would allow better use of water column data? At the top of the list, we put calibration. Jean-Marie has already raised this question in this presentation. And it is clear that hydrographic multibeam ecosounders are not calibrated. This limits the use of water column data to relative modes. Only data from the same system are comparable as long as the acquisition parameters are kept stable. The calibration of the water column by Iframe method could provide an answer to this question. This is a quite complex procedure. It requires a stable reference area, reference measurement with a calibrated single beam ecosounder, measurement from which the reference angular responses will be established. From the measurement taken on the reference zone with the multi-beam ecosounder, we can derive the base score file. So we pass from this reference angular response to a derived multi-beam correction file, base score file, but you have to know that you have to create one base score file per mode, meaning that per sector mode, per frequency, per pulse length. So it's quite complicated. But we expect that as the seabed backscatter is derived from water column, we expect that this base score file we will create will be valid for water column as well. So that will allow us to use multi-beam in multiple sector modes. Automatic spike flashy echogram suppression. Nore talk about that. We regularly observe flashy echogram with the EM 2040 dual RX from the Simons Tevin. This flashy echogram, you see some example of this flashy echogram, evokes a coherent noise that can be found in a lot of multi-channel transducers, regardless of brands. And these flashy echograms are marked by strong peaks of amplitudes on the echo integration curves and bias the statistic, in particular the range and the variance of the data. So they must be suppressed, and actually Sonarscope allow manual removal, but that can be automatized. It should be automatized. So that's a development that is necessary for us to win time in the processing. Anyone who has worked with water column data from a modern multi-beam ecosounder knows that the amount of data generated is absolutely enormous. This amount of data can be prohibitive as it makes processing so slow even with the latest generation workstation. In addition, much of the water column data does not contain any useful information. This is well illustrated by this example. This line was recorded by following a dredging vessel to capture its plume. For 2 minutes of navigation, the generated file is almost 700 megabytes. In fact, only 41% of this data contain useful information. Several solutions must be considered to reduce the amount of data from water column acquisition. Data acquisition on board, we can reduce the ping rate. We do that, but it's not the best solution. Automatic reduction of data from a system, that can be an interesting thing. And summarize information by voxelization is also something that must be considered. Okay. The last point I want to evoke with you is the necessity to establish models which will allow us to derive the concentration of suspended particle, assuming an average particle size, to transform the acoustic data, to translate, to inverse the acoustic data to information, to translate this decibel value into SPM concentration. grams per liter. Derived model from acoustic and in situ measurement carried out jointly at sea is extremely challenging. And this is due to the extreme spatial and temporal variance of the sediment plumes, which handicaps the correlation with in situ measurement of particles in suspension acquired with optical sensor and water samples. Here you see 2 ecograms that are separated only by 2 seconds and 4 meters. And these 2 ecograms show very different value in the use part of the water column just above the specular. Clearly, to guarantee a reliable correlation between the acoustic data and in situ measurement, the 2 families of measurements must be carried out jointly at the same time at the same place. From a research vessel, it is very difficult to have this guarantee. That probably explains why the correlation between water column amplitude and particle measurement in situ that we have measured are not really significant. The answer could be could come from model derived from experiment data acquired in a control environment. And this is the purpose, this is the objective of the backscatter and flume project, which is under final development after having successfully passed the feasibility study in October 2020. One objective of this big project is to perform acoustic measurement with calibrated instrument of plumes generated with varying amount of sand of different grain size using the sound shower. Here, as part of the feasibility study, we use a quite artisanal system. You have a plastic tube, we pour the sand into the plastic tube. The EM 2040 compact system was installed at 1 meter below the water level. And you see that it can catch the plume here, a plume generated by 20 grams of sand of a diameter of around 250 micrometer. So we use 400 kilohertz and a pulse length of 25 microseconds, but you see clearly the plume passing through the swath. And the total depth of the plume is 8 meters. So using this system, we can modify the weight of sand, or we can play with the diameter and combine the measurement. Here you see a measurement of 3 plumes using the same diameter range of sand at 400 kilohertz and 25 microseconds. For 300 grams, 37 grams and 3 grams. And 3 grams, surprisingly, you see perfectly the plume passing through the swath. 3 grams of sand is more or less a teaspoon of sand. So, and of course, we can integrate the data into the same geometry, and you see the eco integration of this plume passing through the geometry. And obviously, you see a clear relation between the maximum of the mean value with the weight of the sand. So for each of these plumes, eco integration has been calculated and show a good correlation with the weight of sand. So on the basis of these results acquired within the framework of this feasibility study of this big BSCF project, the teams that are involved in the project are optimistic about the possibility of deriving experimental model that will make it possible to translate the level in decibel measured in the water column in the real condition at sea in particle concentration, assuming an average diameter. So that can be a good answer to our question, which model can we use to translate this acoustic data to information? The main concluding observation after this talk is that quantification is feasible, but it's extremely challenging. It requires a dedicated calibrated acoustic devices, synchronized ground truthing, model development, software continuously responding to new development. It is also necessary to integrate hydrodynamic and navigational data in real time. There are pros and cons to the use of hydrographic multibeam ecosounder for this type of measurement. Certainly, a definitive advantage to use an hydrographic multibeam equipment is that you just use one system to carry out a series of measurements as bathymetry, bottom backscatter, and water column together. However, we cannot neglecting the use of dedicated instruments such as single beam ecosounder and scientific multi-beam ecosounder, which are perfectly dedicated for that purpose and which are fully calibrated. And I'm thinking about the new research vessel Belgica, which is equipped with several single beam system and scientific multi-beam, the Kongsberg MA70, which can be used for that as well. So we are looking to use that equipment as well for detecting dredging plumes. I will conclude this talk with an interesting analogy with a micro-rain radar. So you see first this image, this now classical image of a plume catch by an hydrographic multi-beam system. And you see this image is a view of the raindrops view by a micro radar from the soil, from the earth. So we are extremely surprised by this. Not surprised, but we are really enthusiastic to see this analog with the image of plumes of sand in the water column. I thank you very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Mark and Koen, for your presentation. I guess this concludes our webinar for this morning. Maybe one last thing before we go into a noon break. As I've shown before, so this afternoon at 2 o'clock, we will reconvene with those who are interested and those who have questions. If you have questions, remarks, or anything related to this morning or other multi-beam water column related stuff, you can email it to me or you can put it in the chat, and then we will start gathering those questions and yeah, start discussing them at 2 o'clock. So I hope to see you all then. I suggest you can all leave the meeting, and then if you want to re-enter, that of course will be possible this afternoon. Hope to see many of you then, and have a nice lunch. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you all had a satisfying lunch. In the meantime, and Mark is waving nicely to all of you. In the meantime, we had a couple of questions sent to me by email. I will check again if I have another one. No, okay. Then I can share my screen with the questions. And we discussed a little bit amongst each other who is going to respond to that. But of course, if anybody has an addition he wants to do, please do so. It's not like we have to do the discussion, it's up to all of us. So this is a warm welcome to everybody to intervene whenever you feel like you can do a good one. I will share a Word document and we will go over the questions one by one. I hope that everybody can see it right now. Okay. So the first one is from Dilip at Hikari from Hamburg. And he has a question, especially for Jean-Marie, about the detection in deeper waters. So, of course, I give the floor to Jean-Marie for this. Jean-Marie, I think you're still muted. Jean-Marie, you're still muted. You have to unmute.
Okay. You hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Dilip, are you here?
Yes.
Yes?
Hi.
Okay.
I already contacted you once.
Yes, we exchanged some emails, and I send you back to Carla because she's the specialist for the she's always on on the cruises and so on. For me, I do the software, so I'm not quite sure of what we see and so on. And so I send back your question to Carla. She's on board, pourquoi pas, now. Perhaps at the end of I will get an answer from her. I propose that we come back to your question later.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also contacted her once, but I haven't got her reply. Maybe she's very busy with her schedule and stuff. So maybe she will reply at some point.
I know that the scientists, when there are papers in comment en cours, they prefer to wait for these questions. I don't know.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Okay, so that's something to come back on later. It was also a very specific question indeed, which is always good, of course, but then you can discuss it further amongst each other. Then we had two questions from Mario Veloso from Geomar. And the first one is related to the fact that indeed 2 or 3 years ago we had a survey on board of the Belgian vessel Simon Steven, which also had an EK80 with it, single beam, to do a calibration. And that was a survey where Peter Urban, Mark Rush, Jens Greinet, I think they were all joining. So I'm guessing this is a question for Peter or for Mark. I don't know if any of you are present and maybe could start discussing the fact if this is a useful fact.
Hi, Peter here. Yeah, it's a bit funny because actually Mario is also a colleague of mine.
Yes.
And that's why I also know, I think he's not here right now actually, because he said, oh no, I can't join this afternoon.
He said he had a meeting this afternoon, so.
Yeah, yeah, but it's he's very interested in the currently we're all in home office, that's why we don't see every day, but I know that he's very interested in the broadband also for the bubble acoustics, and therefore also for the particle sizes, but I will also tell him when I see him, we did not use the broadband acoustics because at the moment when we joined the cruise we were really still focusing on how to get this sort of comparison between the EK80 and the Multibeam, how to get it at all. And that's why we didn't want to play too much yet with these kinds of settings that we don't have any experience in actually, because I personally have no experience on how turbidity data or in general sediment data look in the broadband data. And I think it can give you very interesting results because you have multiple frequencies. But we don't know it yet, actually. So it would be something interesting, definitely. If anybody ever has some EK80 around and would we do it, I think it would be also interesting to record broadband data. But as for the questions here, we did not have it on board.
Okay, thank you, Peter, for your answer. Indeed, it's strange that the two colleagues cannot talk right now, but of course, due to home office, that makes a lot of sense.
No, actually not, because yeah, I don't. Yeah, maybe he wanted to discuss this early, this question, or like in a bigger group. So if anybody else has some experience of using the broadband data, or has some experience of using broadband data on sediment, I think it would be really interesting to discuss this in a bigger group, and maybe that was his aim why he asked this question.
Yeah. And indeed, an online webinar is then a bit less suited for this than, of course, a real physical meeting where you can do this.
Yeah.
With a poster and a glass of wine, but it's a good onset and people can start thinking about it.
Mark, I can say something about that. I am Rida from Iframe. So as presented Mark before, we started an European project which is called BS in Flume, and we made some measurements with the broadband EK80 in sediment. And we have already some results from the feasibility test. We have a spectrum of sand plumes, but this is still a feasibility test, and the inversion of model from the SV measurement for the plume grain sizes will be one of the objects of this project. So Iframe and our team are working only in fish schools, so we have many models for fish, something like that. We have a dedicated software which is called Movies, but in sediment in our teams, we have teams and other teams in Iframe who work on these issues, but in our teams, the teams of Jean-Marie and Asti, we only look for fish. But among the BS in Flume project, it will be one of the objectives of this project is to try to evaluate the grain size from EK80 measurements.
That's very interesting. Could you tell me the name of the project again, so I can?
It's BS. It's backscatter in Flume. BS in Flume.
In Flume. Okay, that's very interesting. So whenever we will have the chance of getting measurements again, taking measurements of plumes, then maybe actually I will also try to get in contact with you and this project.
Yeah, maybe in a few months, maybe if Mark, if you agree, we'll publish some of results from the feasibility test measurements.
If I can add something, the feasibility test was mainly to evaluate the capability of these different acoustic devices, EK80, EM 2040, to really do very good measurement in a so restricted environment. The advantage of this restricted environment is that you can control absolutely everything, but there is another disadvantage, is that you are quite far away from a natural situation, but something can be done in this direction, that producing experimental models from very highly controlled measurements, because you control the shape of the plume, you can control of course the acoustic measurement themselves. So it's another way to consider the acoustic, to do measurements in a control environment. It's so difficult to do that on sea, to control all these aspects. There is a link with another question on that. We will come back with that later. Okay, Peter, glad to see you again. And you know, next webinar, we will invite the people from the acoustic, and not only Multibeam user, but that's the first webinar on this topic. So
yeah, yeah.
Maybe that's indeed a good thing to note. Like I told in the beginning, this grew from a very small thing to half a conference so far. So in the future, we indeed have to invite people from all sorts of backgrounds, because we are indeed missing acousticians and maybe also oceanographers, because there's mostly geologists right now. But indeed, good remark, Mark. If nothing else on the first question of Mario, we can move on to his second question, where he asked if we could also use theoretical approaches to transform volume backscatter from calibrated echosounders. I think this is maybe more specifically aimed at the project at FLIS, the Timbers project. So maybe I'm looking at Nora to have a first go.
Yeah, we can be very short on that. No, we have not tried it. So in the Timbers project, we're only focusing on the empirical relationship, but it would be definitely good in the future, like we already mentioned here, to invite some acousticians and people who know more about that background, and yeah, try to find a way to solve this issue theoretically, or to find a way to combine our both approaches or some way. So that would be good for in the future, that we, yeah, that we extend this webinar to other fields.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I cannot solve this question, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And the fact is also that you have not only grain size or sediment of different grain sizes, but also plankton, for example, and other particles in the water columns. So you can drop several theoretical calibration files. You'll still need to have you'll still have natural variability where all of these come together.
And the problem is that we don't know that much about the natural variability in the North Sea.
We know a lot, but not
everything. And yeah, that's another issue.
Maybe somebody else has a thought on this question from Mario, or the answer that me and Nora tried to set up.
I think I can say something about that. I think people who work in the to estimate the grain size from acoustic, I think they use very high frequency from the EcoSCAT systems, but from EK80, I think there isn't a lot of work on this issue. That's why we will try among our project is in Flume to try to do that. But I think people who work on it, on this problem, they use a system with more than 1 megahertz frequency. So with the EK80, I think it's there isn't a lot of things in sediment plumes, only in just for fish assessment, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. True. Okay. Okay, then maybe good to move on to the next question which you received. That was from Samuel Deleu from MDK, so Maritime Services here in Belgium. He says, regarding the big size of data files, has there already been a discussion with the developers to tackle this? Do they have ideas to diminish the size, keeping the same quality, or can we discuss it with them? I think from our side, we haven't had this discussion yet with them, but we have had this discussion with Jean-Marie, which is then, of course, at the processing side of the workflow. So maybe Jean-Marie, you can elaborate a bit on what you just told before is about the new NetCDF format.
Yeah. At first, for the raw data, the KML, the .org KML or the S7 key, for me, nothing has been done on this field except a trial that Pavel did when he was in Rezon before he went to Norbit. He did a work with a student in Poland for trying to use the classical image compression for the water column data, but it was not transformed in something in the file format after. So for me, for the raw data, we don't have to wait anything for the moment. Now, with Sonarscope, when you load data, you create what we name a cache file. Up to last year, the cache files were elementary files. So for one .all file, for example, you had hundreds of elementary files. Every elementary file was for one parameter. And so, and now I switched to a NetCDF the data format. For one .all file, you have only one NetCDF file, and the data is compressed. And I have here under on my second screen the comparison of the size of the data for the .all and .wcd file. I have 351 megabytes here, and the cache file, which contains everything that is inside the .all and WSD is 256 megabytes. So you see that you win 100 megabytes on the cache file, which contains everything. Another advantage of these sorry, I'm going to perhaps I can share the
yeah, personally I will stop sharing mine, so now you can share your screen.
Écran partagé. Wait a moment. Where is it? Tac. Where is this? I have always problems with this sharing. I have the screen as a. Perhaps I. Okay, let's a moment. Okay, it's here. I try again. It's time to be retired. These new tools for me. Where is it? Okay.
Okay, boomer.
You see. So, okay. You have here the netcdf file, which is seen with a tool made by the NASA, the Panoply application. So I just double-clicked on my netcdf file, and you have what we name groups, for example, depths. And here you have the variable depth. You can double-click on it and display the data directly. If I take sound speed, double-click on it and create a graph. Okay, yes, there is nothing here. I can take attitude, roll. Okay, you have the plot directly. So it's a very useful data format because you have such a tool to inspect the content of your data. It's auto descriptive, and the data is compressed. And it's very simple to read this data in MATLAB or Python or anything else. You read this variable in 3 lines. Open the file, read with the FID of the file. You give the group name, attitude, and the name of the variable, and you get the parameter. And after you close the file. So yeah, open, read, close. It's the alone thing that you need. For the water column data, it's exactly the same. So that's why I wanted to present you this this part of the. And for example, if you want to win space on your disk, you could imagine that you have your raw file somewhere. You don't touch them at all. You just copy them on your working directory. You create the cache, and after you could say, okay, my .all files, I keep this. I create a new. I reduce this file to 0 bytes. It still exists, but with the 0, 1 byte. And Sonarscope will continue to work because as soon as the cache is done, you just give a name and automatically it goes to through the cache file. That's my answer. Okay.
Thank you.
There is a question about Norbit also, Jean-Marie. In
yes,
Sonarscope.
The question to to Norbit was, sorry, I'm going to leave the...
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen again.
Yeah, okay.
The question about if it's possible for Norbit and R2Sonic systems to use them in Sonarscope and how.
Yes, it is possible, but only with a S7K file format. And I did a lot of some trials with files that Pavel sent to me with watercolor data, and it was okay.
Yeah. On a more practical side, we are also doing some tests here at FLIS because we also have a Norbit. And indeed, for example, you cannot use Quincy. Well, you can, but then you don't get the S7K format, so you have to use other acquisition software. And we also have Navak, a Dutch acquisition software, which can produce the S7K format from the Norbit data, so then you can import it into Sonarscope.
Mm-hmm.
This is one example. All right. Any more comments on Samuel Deleu's questions? Somebody who wants to add anything?
About the size of the WC files, I think in the CIS5 from Kongsberg, there is now more option to choose. I think there is 4 or 5 options to choose the quality of water column data. So it depends in the user. So you can use the resolution that you look for, and then the file, the size of the file, it will depend on it. But I think it's there is more option than the CIS4.
May I add something about that? Again, the user is free to set the ping rate. Huh? A good way to limit the amount of data is just to limit the ping rate. But of course, you limit the ping rate for all the data. There is no way to do that other than playing with that for us. So you have to accept to reduce the amount of data. But do you really need so much data for the water column? I'm not sure about that. I think it's not a question about only, it must be smart, because reducing the data means that for me more keeping the informative part of the data rather than reducing all the data by the same way. You need to keep the same amount of the data when the data are really contain something. For me, seawater is seawater. I would like just to have the log during the event inside the seawater when you see plumes of sediment. And the problem is that you log a lot of data that are completely unusable for your study, that are not relevant. They don't contain any information about plumes. And you have to log all this data, and that occupies a lot of space. By a simple calculation, it's more or less 50% of the data for us of all data are not informative. They don't contain any information about plume. So, and that's really the most important point, is that it must be a smart reducing of data, not only reducing data. Reducing data, you can do that very well by just limiting the ping rate. But you need to keep the ping rates where during the time when you have informative data. I mean data that can produce information. And that's not so easy. So I don't see a solution from the companies arriving. They just say, okay, when you see the price of a hard disk, don't hesitate, log everything. So that's a common answer. Huh? You make a balance between the price of a survey and the price of a hard disk. So log everything as much as you can. The problem is after that, how to automatically just focus on the informative part of your data set. And it must be something like, a GNU system that just limit the data you have to consider. So it's a remark.
But it also depends on your application. For example, we have a project here close to shore, and there we see that the Norbit automatically lowers its ping rate when it's in water column collection mode to 5 Hertz, Well, we would like to have more because we really need high resolution water column data. Then it's very annoying that the fact that the ping rate gets reduced automatically. That's not a good thing. So in some cases you do want it differently. And indeed, I think Rita said that you can choose the quality of the water column data. Also for the Norbit in the GUI, you can choose the quality of the water column data, but that still doesn't solve the fact that your ping rate needs to be adaptable. And I think preferably you have a ping rate for the bathymetry and a ping rate for the water column data. That if you do a survey, that you can say bathymetry, let's say full on, full force, everything, and then every 5th or every 10th ping, I want the information on the water column data as well. And I think that's very easy for the acquisition people to put that into their software.
That is something that must be asked directly to Kongsberg and to Sonar's company. I think it is something that can be put on the table for in a conference like FAME for Kongsberg user. I'm sure it can be implemented. I agree that to have 2 ping rate, one for the bathymetry and the bottom backscatter, and one for the water column data could be a solution. But anyway, you will just keep all the data. You will not separate the informative part of the data with the non-informative part of the data. But you don't know that by advance. I agree.
Mark,
it's difficult.
I have something to say about this subject. On several FEM meetings, I pushed the idea to have a sort of push button. When you see something in the water column data, you would push the click on the button, and you would store the water column data from, for example, 10 minutes before to 10 minutes after. You see, you would have the keeping of the paste in memory, and you would do
a buffer.
Yes, a buffer. And they said, okay, that's a good idea, but I think they don't intend to do it. And the last time they said, yes, but now we think you don't need water column data anymore. You have the multi detection. If you use multi detection, it will give you the information on the plumes. So it's a question to avoid the answer.
Okay. Anybody else who wants to add anything on the format and the size reduction? Okay, I don't see anybody popping up. Okay, then we go to questions that we received from Jelle Malsgaard from EMDC. I'll just read it. So does the optimization of the parameters for water column data, mostly reducing artifacts and noise, has an effect or a negative effect on bathymetry data? A lot of filter settings can be enabled or disabled, but when replaying data, some of it, of course, cannot. Or will it always be a trade-off between primarily high-quality bathy data or water column data? I think Noor may be well suited to first answer this.
Yes, this is a very relevant question, I think, and something that we definitely need to address further into the future. Because at the moment, like recording water column data has always been like the weird feature in Kongsberg that only a few people record this. But in the future, this will become more common. So it would be good if you have some kind of combined settings that we can use for both the bathymetry and the water column data. But at the moment, there are some issues like we already discussed. For the water column data, you try to reduce your ping rate because you don't want too much data. And for the bathymetry, you don't want to do that. So at the moment, I would say there is a trade-off. Also, for instance, the beam overlap. So we chose to not have a beam overlap to make the processing afterwards easier. But for bathymetry data, you want the beam overlap. And also the beam spacing, we choose an equiangular beam spacing, and for the bathymetry, you use an equidistant beam spacing. So those are a few settings that are fundamentally different. So I don't know, Mark, if you can
yes.
on that.
Yes, it's finally it's a common debate. Huh? You have to find if you want to do the free measurement together, bathymetry, bottom backscatter, and water column backscatter, you need to find a compromise between all these settings. And it's clear that don't use the optimal settings that hydrographer use, maximum frequency, shorter pulse length, for example, to log the water column data. It's not a good idea, and it's not a good idea as well for the bottom backscatter. These are the same data, water column backscatter and bottom backscatter data. So if you want to have if you want to do all this job together with the same equipment at the same time on sea, you have to find a compromise between these settings. You have no other choice. So, and again, these settings for the backscatter are quite in opposite with the optimal settings for the bathymetry. And that's a pity, but it's like that with the hydrographic multibeam. That's the reason why in our conclusion, we mentioned that probably some equipment are better to use for the water column investigation. We are talking about single beam approach and about as well a scientific multibeam like the multibeam that is installed on the new research vessel Belgica, the MA70 from Kongsberg, which is really dedicated for that. And again, what we are doing is we use a tool that is mainly produced for hydrographic purposes to use this tool to investigate the water column. But I'm not sure you need to find a compromise to use that tool. And again, think about the pulse length. Huh? We use a medium pulse length because there is no solution about that. And if you change the pulse length, that changes dramatically your amplitude. So, and probably medium pulse length is not the best pulse length for hydrographic purposes. You know, I know that some hydrographers, they try to use the high frequency with the shortest pulse length to really have to optimize the fine detection of very fine objects. And it's the total reverse philosophy for the bottom backscatter and the water column backscatter. So we try to increase the pulse length and to not use necessarily the highest frequency. So again, it must be a compromise, and you have no choice. You have to, to reduce the quality, slightly to reduce the quality of your bathymetric data to have pretty good quality for the bottom backscatter and water column backscatter. But anyway, with our measurement, we don't see any drastic change of the bathymetry of the data we collect with the water column, with the settings for the water column. If that is an answer for you, so I have no other remark about that.
I think it's definitely a good answer. I don't know if Jelle is present and thinks that the question is answered sufficiently. Maybe I can also add that I think for a survey, you first need to have you should always set your first priority. If in timbers we go for water column data, we choose the optimal settings for water column data. We've had surveys where we wanted better seabed backscatter data, and then we choose the optimal settings for that, but then your bathymetry might not be optimal. It will still be good, but it will not be optimal. So there's always a trade-off, and you will always have your first goal being either bathymetry, seabed backscatter, or water column backscatter, and then you also get the other data just like that. So yeah, it will always be adapted to your priority.
But still, it would be nice to maybe in the future test it out, to have a test to see and find some kind of common ground. Like these are, if you want to record it all, what are the best settings to use? Something like that. I think that's an interesting idea to pitch. Somebody wants to write a paper on this.
Yeah, but you will never have the best settings for one of the.
No.
If I can add something to this, just very quickly, it's also not so easy to find the good settings for all different water column applications. For example, you're looking for a sediment plume that is widely distributed. But if we are hunting for gas bubble streams, we want to have a really high ping rate again. Otherwise, we will miss some of them. So even there's always some trade-off. And you have to look at your specific application and not just, is it water column data, or is it backscatter, or is it bathymetry? But I agree with Thomas. You have a primary target, and then the bathymetry, I think, usually with modern multibeams is still quite good, even in the not optimal settings.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes you have to lower the frequency a bit to have better backscatter, and then your bathymetry might be slightly less good, but it will still be very good to use, of course. So that's something to keep in mind. But apart from that, indeed, Peter is right that even within water column applications, you have different approaches. Somebody else who wants to pitch in on this? No? Then we already go towards the final question that we received. And this is again one for, I guess, Jean-Marie, because it talks about Sonarscope. Can it be used to process stationary water column data, a time series on a fixed location, and then to be used together with ADCP, for example, on a K-wall, on a bottom frame, or on a buoy? So Jean-Marie, is that an option in Sonarscope?
Yes, for the moment, because Sonarscope was made for classical acquisition scenarios as surveys. So if I don't find a position on, it cannot work. It doesn't find bathymetry datagrams, it doesn't do anything. So that the question, it's not the first time I am asked to give an answer for this, and my own colleagues push to have a solution. So I have to take time for that. The problem is I have so many things to do. But for the moment, if you don't have a position, you cannot process the data.
And if you assign a position, one position, the same position to all different pings, can Sonarscope then process the data?
Well, even the same position, but you must have a position.
Okay.
Yes, it works but you need a position. So if you put your multibeam on the same place, but it must be plugged with a positioning system, a CPAS of anything, it works very well. But except that you see some vibration due to the shift of the RTK system, you see that, but it will produce data. But you need a position and a depth.
The same problem is for if you use your sounder, for example, shallow water sounders in deep water just to see particles in the water. Sonarscope will not work because Kongsberg doesn't deliver the depth datagrams. And the same question, it was asked to me half an hour by Carla from the Pourquoi Pas. She acquired passive, she used the sounder, the Multibeam Ecosounder, as a passive sounder. So there is no transmission. And she said, the data is here. I could see the water column data on the sounder, but I cannot do anything with Sonarscope. So Jean-Marie, please, could you do something? So the answer I sent to her, okay, after the webinar, I will have a look on this problem. That's all.
So the conclusion is that Jean-Marie cannot retire and that he has to keep on working on Sonarscope forever and ever.
Or we should clone him.
Yes. Okay. Does anybody else want to ask a question, intervene, or say something that he or she has heard or comment on?
I have a question from Gel from IMDC. Is Sonarscope and Globe freely available for commercial use? Sonarscope and Globe are free completely. And when you go on the download page, you have text that gives the conditions. So to be precise, go on the download web page and you will have all the information. But you will see that it's free.
Yeah, maybe we can put that in the concluding email that we're going to send after the meeting to add the download link to for Sonarscope software.
I will send it to you.
Okay. Anybody else who wants to add something?
Yes, Stéphanie Dupré. I came a bit late and I saw the first question, so maybe I can complete what Jean-Marie said.
Okay.
Maybe if you could come back to it. Yeah. I'm a marine geologist, geophysicist, and I'm working on gas bubble detection with the help of Jean-Marie and his team. So the question was about the deep water detection of hydrothermal fluids. So actually there was no, because I was part also of the job, there was no spatial processing of the data. It was just visualization of all the echograms and I mean from the shipborne echogram, of course. The deep detection that Jean-Marie showed with really tiny anomaly stick to the floor. So there was no special thing, just experience and eyes and patience.
Yeah. And based on the small thing you saw, you send out AUV to get a better image of this event.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we were also able to detect in other area where we didn't have the chance to dive with an AUV, but where we suspect also some hydrothermal fluid emission. Of course, it's most of the time we don't detect these tiny things. It with cases like this, it's really rare at this depth. And the depth Jean-Marie showed was not even so deep than 2 or 3 kilometers. It was 1,600 meters.
Do you have an idea about the vertical resolution at that depth of the water column data?
Yes, we have been calculating this by heart. I cannot remember, but we are really close to it. Yeah, maybe it's on. I will say regarding the image, it can be only a couple of times or a few times more than the resolution, than the vertical resolution. Yes. It has to be just also, you need to pick a really high amplitude sometimes. And as Jean-Marie showed this morning, you have this amplification effect also in the vertical direction.
Good.
Most of them, we are not able to detect them. We have to be true about this. It's, there is to have really the specific condition. I mean, the real fluid emission, and just the proper angle beam, the right things. But it's not the common case to detect as such deep water depth, I will say.
And do you have to be lucky that the vent then emits a lot of gas at the moment that you go over it? Otherwise, you might also not detect it, probably.
Yeah, of course. These are hydrothermal fluids. So you have also particles and maybe it increase, but just for methane bubble, usually it's easier in acoustically speaking to detect them. Yeah.
Yeah.
The contrast is much more, it's stronger. So even we had the experience, of course, at even mostly shallower water depths, but even a few tiny gas bubbles, you are able to detect them. I mean, from methane bubble compared to hydrothermal fluids, which are more difficult to track, but it's possible. Yeah. And when you are enough close to it, it's relatively easy to pick them up.
Yeah, with AUV data. Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the answer.
Yeah, thank
you very much.
Thank you for all the talk and the organization. It's a really nice webinar. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks for these kind words as well. Looking to the other participants, if somebody still wants to add something. If not, okay, then I think we can conclude this.
I have just a question for Mark and for Multibeam water corner users. If that's, I want to know if they use other software, commercial software, and what they think. If did they compare Sonarscope with this software, or what they feel about that? Because
Yes.
if you remember, we want to ameliorate our software, and we try always to be to develop things for scientists and to be near the scientists, and we respond to their questions.
Yes, we have to be honest with. Even is criminal to say that now, but we use as well FM midwater. The polar echogram you have seen from the BSEF project have been produced using FM midwater. Why? Because it's the fault of Jean-Marie. He didn't implement the capability to use a multibeam without any positioning system and to present the echogram with that. So we are waiting of this capability, and we probably switch off the maintenance license for FM midwater. But yes, we use as well FM midwater. Yes, but it's what we call a producing software. You know, I think it's such a software that it's not analytical and scientific software for us. You are not capable to extract as we can do with Sonarscope all these extremely nice information from the echogram. It's not easy to do that with FM midwater, and you don't have all these functionalities. But for a quick visualization, yes, it can be used for that as well. Yes. But with the new release of Sonarscope next month, that allow us to use a multibeam without a positioning system, we will let FM midwater somewhere in your office.
Thanks, Mark.
If that reply to the question, I'm a little bit confused to to say that, but yes, we use FM midwater sometimes.
Yeah, and for this, for Norris project, for Timbers, we use Sonarscope, and we are also a big fan, also because we could directly be in contact with Jean-Marie, who implemented a lot of features for us. Only for like shipwreck detections and just bottom detections in the water column, so to say, we use the FM midwater and the tool in Chimera. But for all other water column related and analytical detections, we use Sonarscope.
I'm a real Sonarscopian. I'm only loyal to Jean-Marie.
I'm probably one of the first Sonarscopian in this meeting. So
yeah, that's true.
It's a fight.
You're the pioneer, Mark.
Yes, Jean-Marie is the pioneer, but I'm a user. But I must say, it's a unique software, so there is no question about that. And congratulations, Jean-Marie, and thank you for all the work done since all these years.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. I think this is a nice way again to conclude our webinar. I want to repeat that if you wouldn't like your name to appear in a post-webinar email. As a participant, you just send me an email, because probably at the end of this week or beginning of next week, I'll send around a small email with concluding remarks, participants, maybe also presentations, and then the link to download Sonarscope and so on. So with some practical information. So if you wouldn't want to appear in that list, just drop me an email. And otherwise, I have nothing else but to thank Nore, who's with me here, Jean-Marie, Mark, and Koen for the presentations. And then also, of course, everybody who sent us a question and all those who just participated today. And hopefully for a next meeting regarding water column data, it can again be a physical one at EGU, so GeoHub or any other conference. So that would be a big advance already. Thank you all, and hope to see you in real life next time.